The book of 2 Samuel tells the story of David, a man chosen by God to lead Israel after King Saul. The narrative begins with difficult moments as David learns of the deaths of Saul and his friend Jonathan. We follow David's journey from a humble shepherd to the great king of all Israel. We'll witness his struggles, victories, and how he brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. It's a story filled with emotion, betrayal, triumph, and the guiding presence of God every step of the way. You'll also meet important figures like Abner, Ish-bosheth, and Joab, each of whom played a key role during this pivotal time in history. Get ready for an incredible journey through the first 6 chapters of 2 Samuel, where we watch a man, after God's own heart, rise to the throne of Israel. After the battle against the Philistines, David had just returned to Ziklag following his defeat of the Amalekites. On the 3rd day, a man arrived from Saul's camp. His clothes were torn and dust covered his head, clear signs of deep mourning. As he approached David, he bowed down to the ground in respect. David asked anxiously, "Where have you come from?" "I have escaped from the Israelite camp," the man replied in chapter 1, verse 3. David's heart began to race. Something terrible had happened. "What happened? Tell me," he urged. The messenger then delivered devastating news. The men fled from the battle. Many fell and died, and Saul and his son Jonathan are dead. David wanted to know how the man was certain that Saul had died. The man explained that he had been on Mount Gilboa and saw Saul leaning on his spear, with enemy chariots and horsemen closing in. According to him, Saul called out and asked to be killed, as he was in agony and about to be captured. "So I stood over him and killed him, because I knew that after he had fallen, he could not survive. I took the crown that was on his head and the bracelet that was on his arm, and I have brought them here to my lord," the man said in verse 10. Upon hearing this, David tore his clothes, a sign of deep grief. All the men with him did the same. They mourned, fasted, and wept until evening for Saul, for Jonathan, and for the army of the Lord that had fallen by the sword. Rather than rejoice over the death of someone who had long persecuted him, David was deeply grieved. He turned to the young messenger and asked, "Where are you from?" "I am the son of a foreigner, an Amalekite," the man replied. David then questioned him, "How is it you were not afraid to lift your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" Verse 14. Without delay, David called one of his men and ordered, "Go and strike him down." The soldier struck the Amalekite and he died. David said, "Your blood be on your own head. Your own mouth testified against you when you said, 'I killed the Lord's anointed.'" Grief-stricken, David composed a lament for Saul and Jonathan. He commanded that it be taught to the people of Judah and recorded in the book of Jashar. In his lament, David cried out, "Your glory, O Israel, lies slain on your heights. How the mighty have fallen." Verse 19. He continued his lament by pleading that the news not be spread among the Philistines, lest they rejoice. He cursed the mountains of Gilboa, where the shields of the mighty were cast aside. He honored the bravery of Saul and Jonathan, who were loved and admired in life, and not separated even in death. About Jonathan in particular, his dear friend, David poured out his heart. "I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You were very dear to me. Your love for me was more wonderful than that of women." Verse 26. This was David's response to the death of Israel's first king, demonstrating his noble character and respect for God's appointed authority, even though that authority had once pursued him. After the mourning period, David sought divine guidance for his next steps. He didn't act on impulse or seize the throne by force. Instead, in chapter 2, verse 1, David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I go up to one of the towns of Judah?" The Lord said, "Go up." David asked, "Where shall I go?" "To Hebron," the Lord answered. Obeying God's direction, David went up to Hebron with his 2 wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. He also brought his men along, each with his family. They all settled in the towns around Hebron. Then, in a solemn and historic moment, the men of Judah came to Hebron and anointed David king over the tribe of Judah. Verse 4. Thus began David's reign at the age of 30. Although he was from the tribe of Judah, he did not yet rule over all of Israel. One of his first acts as king was to honor the bravery of the men of Jabesh-Gilead, who had retrieved and buried the bodies of Saul and his sons. David sent messengers to the men of Jabesh-Gilead to say to them, "The Lord bless you for showing this kindness to Saul your master by burying him. May the Lord now show you kindness and faithfulness, and I too will show you the same favor because you have done this." Verses 5 to 6. David encouraged them to be strong and courageous, reminding them that even though Saul was dead, the tribe of Judah had anointed him as king. This gesture showed David's ability to recognize honorable actions, even toward his former enemy. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Jordan River, something happened that would divide the nation. Abner, Saul's cousin and commander of his army, refused to accept David as king over all Israel. Instead, Abner, son of Ner, the commander of Saul's army, took Ish-bosheth, son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim. He made him king over Gilead, Asherites, Jezreel, Ephraim, Benjamin, and all Israel. Verses 8 to 9. Ish-bosheth was 40 years old when he began to reign over Israel, and he reigned for 2 years. Only the tribe of Judah followed David, so the kingdom was divided. David ruled in Hebron over Judah for 7 years and 6 months, while Ish-bosheth, backed by Abner, reigned over the rest of Israel. This marked the beginning of David's reign, not over a united nation, but over his own tribe. For now, he accepted that reality without forcing his authority over the other tribes. With patience and trust in God, David began his kingship, knowing that the Lord would fulfill his promises at the right time. The division of the kingdom soon led to open conflict. In chapter 2, verse 12, Abner, son of Ner, together with the servants of Ish-bosheth, son of Saul, left Mahanaim and went to Gibeon. On the other side, Joab, son of Zeruiah, and David's men also went out and met them by the pool of Gibeon. The two groups took up positions on opposite sides of the pool, like armies ready for battle. Trying perhaps to avoid greater bloodshed, Abner suggested a contest between young soldiers. "Let some of the young men get up and fight hand to hand in front of us," he said to Joab. Joab agreed. 12 men from Benjamin, representing Ish-bosheth, and 12 of David's men stood up. But what was meant to be a display of skill turned into a slaughter. Each man grabbed his opponent by the head and thrust his dagger into his opponent's side, and they fell down together, recounts verse 16. That place in Gibeon came to be called Helkath Hazurim, meaning field of sharp swords. What began as a controlled contest quickly escalated into a fierce battle. That day the battle was very fierce, and Abner and the Israelites were defeated by David's men, records verse 17. Zeruiah's 3 sons were there, Joab, Abishai, and Asahel. Asahel was as swift as a gazelle in the open field, and he began to chase Abner without turning aside to the right or to the left. Abner looked behind him and asked, "Is that you, Asahel?" He replied, "It is." Sensing the danger, Abner tried to dissuade the young man. "Turn aside to the right or to the left. Seize one of the young men and take his equipment." But Asahel kept pursuing him. Again Abner warned him, "Turn aside from following me. Why should I strike you down? How could I look your brother Joab in the face?" Verse 22. He knew that killing Asahel would bring Joab's vengeance, the older brother and commander of David's army. But Asahel refused to give up, so Abner struck him in the stomach with the butt of his spear so forcefully that the spear came out through his back. Asahel fell there and died on the spot. And everyone who came to the place where Asahel had fallen and died stood still, says verse 23. Joab and Abishai kept pursuing Abner. At sunset, they reached the hill of Ammah near Giah on the way to the wilderness of Gibeon. There, the men of Benjamin regrouped behind Abner, forming a single unit, and took their stand on the top of a hill. Then Abner called out to Joab, "Must the sword devour forever? Don't you realize that this will end in bitterness? How long before you order your men to stop pursuing their fellow Israelites?" Verse 26. Joab replied, "As surely as God lives, if you had not spoken, the men would have continued pursuing their brothers until morning." Verse 27. So Joab blew the trumpet, and all his troops stopped pursuing Israel. Abner and his men marched through the Arabah all that night. They crossed the Jordan, continued marching, and arrived at Mahanaim. Joab stopped chasing Abner and gathered his troops. 19 of David's men were missing, in addition to Asahel. But David's men had struck down 360 men from Benjamin and Abner's forces. They took Asahel and buried him in his father's tomb at Bethlehem. Then Joab and his men marched all night and arrived at Hebron at daybreak. The civil war between the house of David and the house of Saul dragged on for a long time. There was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David, says chapter 3, verse 1. During that time, David grew stronger and stronger, while the house of Saul grew weaker and weaker. As the war dragged on, David's power increased. In chapter 3, we see that his family also grew in Hebron. Sons were born to David in Hebron. His firstborn was Amnon, by Ahinoam of Jezreel. His second, Chileab, by Abigail the widow of Nabal of Carmel. The third, Absalom the son of Maacah daughter of Talmai king of Geshur. The fourth, Adonijah the son of Haggith. The fifth, Shephatiah the son of Abital. And the sixth, Ithream, by David's wife Eglah. Verses 2-5. Meanwhile, Abner was strengthening his position within Saul's house. He was not only the army commander, but also a powerful political figure behind Ish-bosheth's throne. However, a particular incident changed the course of events. Ish-bosheth accused Abner, "Why did you sleep with my father's concubine?" Verse 7, referring to Rizpah, daughter of Aiah. At that time, taking a former king's concubine was considered a claim to the throne. Abner was furious at the accusation. "Am I a dog's head on Judah's side? This very day I'm loyal to the house of your father Saul, to his family and friends. I haven't handed you over to David, and yet now you accuse me of an offense involving this woman." Verse 8. Outraged, Abner made a vow. "May God deal with Abner, be it ever so severely, if I do not do for David what the Lord promised him on oath, and transfer the kingdom from the house of Saul, and establish David's throne over Israel, and Judah from Dan to Beersheba." Verses 9-10. Ish-bosheth didn't dare say another word to Abner because he was afraid of him. Realizing his position was at risk and that Saul's house was weakening, Abner decided to switch sides. He sent messengers to David. "Whose land is it? Make a covenant with me, and my hand shall be with you to bring all Israel over to you." Verse 12. David replied, "Good, I will make a covenant with you. But one thing I require, you must not come into my presence unless you bring Michal, Saul's daughter, when you come to see me." Verse 13. Michal was David's first wife, whom Saul had given to another man while David was on the run. David also sent messengers to Ish-bosheth, demanding, "Give me my wife Michal, whom I betrothed to myself for 100 Philistine foreskins." Ish-bosheth sent and took her from her husband, Paltiel, son of Laish. Her husband followed her, weeping, as far as Bahurim, until Abner ordered him to go back. Abner then spoke with the elders of Israel. "For some time you have wanted to make David your king. Now do it. For the Lord promised David, 'Through my servant David, I will rescue my people Israel from the hand of the Philistines and from all their enemies.'" Verses 17-18. Abner also spoke to the tribe of Benjamin, Saul's own tribe. After that, Abner went to Hebron with 20 men to speak with David about the desires of all Israel and the house of Benjamin. David hosted a banquet for Abner and his men. Then Abner said to David, "Let me go and gather all Israel to my lord the king, so that they may make a covenant with you, and you may reign over all that your heart desires," as stated in verse 21. And David sent Abner away in peace. Abner's defection marked a turning point in the civil war. The powerful general who had upheld Saul's house was now working to unite Israel under David's leadership. Shortly after Abner left, David's men and Joab returned from a raid, bringing much plunder. When Joab learned that Abner had been with David and had left in peace, he was furious. In chapter 3, verse 24, "So Joab went to the king and said, 'What have you done? Abner came to you. Why did you let him go? Now he is gone.'" Joab accused Abner of coming only to spy. Without David's knowledge, Joab sent messengers after Abner, and they brought him back from the well of Sirah, as recorded in verse 26. When Abner returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside into the gateway, as if to speak with him privately, and there he stabbed him in the stomach, and he died for the blood of Asahel his brother, in verse 27. Joab thus avenged his brother's death during the battle at Gibeon. Upon hearing this, David declared, "I and my kingdom are forever innocent before the Lord concerning the blood of Abner son of Ner. May his blood fall on Joab's head and on his whole family line," in verses 28 and 29. David publicly mourned Abner's death, refusing to eat until sunset. Everyone noticed and was pleased with David's response. David said to his officials, "Don't you realize that a prince and a great man has fallen in Israel this day? And though I am the anointed king, today I am weak, and these sons of Zeruiah are too harsh for me. May the Lord repay the evildoer according to his evil deeds," in verses 38 and 39. The news of Abner's death had a devastating effect on Ish-bosheth. In chapter 4, verse 1, when Saul's son heard that Abner had died in Hebron, his hands grew weak, and all Israel was dismayed. Ish-bosheth had 2 men, Baanah and Rechab, captains of raiding bands and sons of Rimmon from Beeroth, a town of Benjamin. They came into Ish-bosheth's house around midday while he was resting. They entered the house as if to get wheat and stabbed him in the stomach. Then Rechab and his brother Baanah escaped, according to verse 6. After killing him, they cut off his head and traveled all night through the Arabah. They brought Ish-bosheth's head to David in Hebron and said, "Here is the head of Ish-bosheth, son of Saul, your enemy, who tried to kill you. Today the Lord has avenged my lord the king against Saul and his descendants," in verse 8. But David replied, "As surely as the Lord lives, who has delivered me out of every trouble, when someone told me, 'Saul is dead,' thinking he was bringing good news, I seized him and put him to death in Ziklag. That was the reward I gave him for his news. How much more, when wicked men kill an innocent man in his own house on his own bed, should I not now demand his blood from your hands and rid the earth of you?" in verses 9 to 11. At David's command, his young men killed Rechab and Baanah. They cut off their hands and feet and hung their bodies beside the pool in Hebron. But they buried Ish-bosheth's head in Abner's tomb in Hebron. With Ish-bosheth's death, the last remaining claimant to Saul's throne had fallen. The way was now clear for David to become king over all Israel. After Ish-bosheth's death, the tribes of Israel finally acknowledged David as their rightful king. In chapter 5, verse 1, "Then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, 'We are your own flesh and blood.'" They remembered David's leadership even during Saul's reign. "In the past, while Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel on their military campaigns. And the Lord said to you, 'You will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become their ruler,'" in verse 2. In a solemn ceremony in Hebron, all the elders of Israel came to King David at Hebron. The king made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel in verse 3. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned for 40 years. In Hebron, he reigned over Judah for 7 years and 6 months, and in Jerusalem he reigned over all Israel and Judah for 33 years, according to verse 5. With all the tribes united under his leadership, David now ruled a strengthened nation. His next step was to establish a capital for the unified kingdom. Until then, he had ruled from Hebron, a city in Judah, but he needed a more central and strategic location, one that all the tribes could see as belonging to them, not just to Judah. The unification of the tribes under David fulfilled the promise God had made long before. Since the days when the young shepherd watched his father Jesse's flocks, God had chosen him to be the king of his people. The journey had been long, filled with challenges, persecution, and waiting. But at last, David stood in the position for which he had been anointed years earlier. This was a crucial moment in Israel's history. After the era of the judges and the troubled reign of Saul, the people now had a king after God's own heart. Under David's leadership, Israel would enter its golden age, expanding its borders and becoming a stronger, unified nation. The unification of the tribes under David also foreshadowed a greater king to come, a descendant of David who would one day unite not just the tribes of Israel, but all peoples under his eternal reign. This promise would later be reaffirmed to David through the prophet Nathan. With the kingdom unified, David decided to establish a new capital. His attention turned to Jerusalem, an ancient Canaanite city still under Jebusite control. In chapter 1, verse 6, the king and his men marched to Jerusalem to attack the Jebusites who lived there. The Jebusites felt so secure behind their walls that they mocked David. "You will not get in here. Even the blind and the lame can ward you off," thinking, "David can't get in here." But David captured the fortress of Zion, which became the city of David. On that day he said, "Whoever attacks the Jebusites, let him go up through the water shaft and strike down the lame and the blind, whom David's soul despises." Verse 8. From this came the saying, "The blind and the lame will not enter the house." David then took up residence in the fortress and named it the City of David, and David built all around from the Millo inward. Verse 9. Under his leadership, the city grew in both size and importance. David's rise didn't go unnoticed by neighboring kings. Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David, along with cedar logs, carpenters, and stonemasons, and they built a house for David. Verse 11. This alliance with Tyre, a powerful maritime and commercial city-state, reflected David's growing influence on the international stage. David then knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel and had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. Verse 12. David recognized that his authority was granted by God, not for his own glory, but for the good of the people. While in Jerusalem, David took more concubines and wives after coming from Hebron, and more sons and daughters were born to him. Verse 13. Among the children born in Jerusalem were Shammua, Shobab, Nathan, Solomon, Ibhar, Elishua, Nepheg, Japhia, Elishama, Eliada, and Eliphalet. When the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over Israel, they mobilized to capture him. Upon hearing this, David went down to the stronghold. Now the Philistines had come and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. Verse 17. David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I go up against the Philistines? Will you deliver them into my hands?" And the Lord answered, "Go up, for I will surely deliver the Philistines into your hands." David went to Baal-perazim and defeated them there. He said, "The Lord has broken through my enemies before me like a breakthrough of waters." Therefore he named that place Baal-perazim, meaning Lord of Breakthroughs. The Philistines abandoned their idols there, and David and his men carried them off. But the Philistines came again and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. Once more David consulted the Lord, and he said, Do not go straight up. Instead, circle around behind them and come upon them in front of the balsam trees. When you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the balsam trees, act quickly, for that will be the Lord going out before you to strike the Philistine army. Verses 23 to 24. David did as the Lord commanded and struck down the Philistines all the way from Gibeon to the entrance of Gezer. These victories secured Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and confirmed that God was with David in battle. The conquest of Jerusalem was one of the most significant achievements of David's reign. The city, strategically located between the northern and southern tribes, would serve as the United Kingdom's capital for generations. Later it would be the site of the temple built by David's son Solomon and become known as the Holy City. After establishing Jerusalem as his capital, David sought to bring the Ark of the Covenant into the city. The Ark, which held the stone tablets of the Ten Commandments, symbolized God's presence among the people. In chapter 6, verse 1, David again gathered all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000. With this large group, David and all the people with him set out from Bala of Judah to bring up from there the Ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord of hosts, who sits enthroned between the cherubim. Verse 2. Bala of Judah is another name for Kiriath-Jearim, where the ark had remained since being returned by the Philistines. They placed the Ark of God on a new cart and brought it from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. And Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, were guiding the new cart. Verse 3. David and the entire house of Israel were celebrating before the Lord with instruments made of cypress wood, harps, lyres, tambourines, castanets, and cymbals. When they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, the oxen stumbled, and Uzzah reached out his hand to steady the ark of God. The Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of his irreverent act, and God struck him down there, and he died beside the ark of God. Verse 7. David was disturbed that the Lord had struck Uzzah down. That place was named Perez Uzzah, meaning Uzzah's breach. David feared the Lord that day and said, "How can the ark of the Lord come to me?" He was unwilling to bring the ark into the city of David. Instead, David took it to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. Verse 10. The ark remained there for 3 months, and the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and his entire household. When David was told that the Lord had blessed Obed-Edom's household because of the ark, he resolved to complete the mission. So David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. Verse 12. This time David took proper precautions. When those carrying the ark of the Lord had taken 6 steps, he sacrificed a bull and a fattened calf. Verse 13. He also danced before the Lord with all his might, wearing a linen ephod. Verse 14. So David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouts and the sound of trumpets. Verse 15. It was a moment of great celebration. The symbolic presence of God was entering the capital, but not everyone shared David's joy. As the ark of the Lord entered the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, looked out of the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. Verse 16. Unbothered by Michal's disapproval, David placed the ark inside the tent he had pitched for it. He offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. And when he had finished offering the sacrifices, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts. Verse 18. He gave every man and woman in the crowd a loaf of bread, a portion of meat, and a cake of raisins. Then all the people returned to their homes. When David returned to bless his household, Michal came out to meet him and said sarcastically, "How distinguished the king of Israel looked today, going around half naked in full view of the servant girls, like some vulgar fellow." Verse 20. David replied, "It was before the Lord, who chose me rather than your father or anyone from his house, when he appointed me ruler over the Lord's people Israel. I will celebrate before the Lord. I will become even more undignified than this, and I will be humiliated in my own eyes. But by these servant girls you mentioned, I will be held in honor." Verses 21-22. As a result of this misunderstanding, Michal, daughter of Saul, had no children to the day of her death. Verse 23. The arrival of the ark in Jerusalem was a pivotal moment in David's reign. By bringing Israel's most sacred symbol into his new capital, he united political and religious authority in one place. Jerusalem became not only the political capital, but also the spiritual center of the nation. This act also demonstrated David's devotion to the Lord. Unlike many kings who used religion merely as a political tool, David genuinely cared about worshiping God. His dance before the ark, despite Michal's criticism, revealed a heart that truly rejoiced in the Lord's presence. The arrival of the ark in Jerusalem marked the completion of the power transition from Saul to David. The process had begun with the news of Saul's death, followed by David's anointing as king of Judah, the civil war, the betrayal and deaths of Abner and Ish-bosheth, the unification of the tribes under David, the conquest of Jerusalem, and finally, the ark entering the city. David was now the undisputed king of a united Israel, with a firmly established capital and the divine blessing symbolized by the ark's presence in Jerusalem. Once David had settled into his cedar palace in Jerusalem and the Lord had granted him rest from all his enemies, something began to stir in his heart. In chapter 7, while speaking with the prophet Nathan, David shared a thought that troubled him. "Here I am, living in a house of cedar, while the ark of God remains in a tent." At first, Nathan encouraged the king, saying, "Go and do all that is in your heart, for the Lord is with you." But that same night, the word of the Lord came to Nathan with a very different message for David. "Go and tell my servant David, this is what the Lord says. Are you the one to build me a house to dwell in? I have not dwelt in a house from the day I brought the Israelites up out of Egypt to this day. I have been moving from place to place with a tent as my dwelling," said the Lord through Nathan in verses 5 and 6. God reminded David how he had taken him from tending sheep to become ruler over Israel, how he had been with him wherever he went, and how he had destroyed all his enemies. But then, instead of allowing David to build him a house, God made a stunning promise. "The Lord declares to you that he himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son," proclaimed the Lord in verses 11 to 14. God also promised, "Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever," as we read in verse 16, when Nathan relayed all these words and this entire vision to David. The king was deeply moved. He went in, sat before the Lord, and said, "Who am I, sovereign Lord, and what is my family, that you have brought me this far? And as if this were not enough in your sight, sovereign Lord, you have also spoken about the future of the house of your servant," as seen in verses 18 and 19. In his prayer of gratitude, David acknowledged God's greatness. "How great you are, sovereign Lord! There is no one like you, and there is no God but you, as we have heard with our own ears," as expressed in verse 22. David concluded his prayer by asking for God's blessing. "And now, Lord God, keep forever the promise you have made concerning your servant and his house. Do as you promised, so that your name will be great forever," as we read in verses 25 and 26. This divine promise to David established an eternal covenant that would shape Israel's future. God promised that David's royal lineage would endure forever, a promise that would extend beyond his son Solomon and find its ultimate fulfillment in a greater descendant whose kingdom would have no end. This covenant became the foundation of the messianic hope that would sustain the people of Israel for centuries. Empowered by this divine promise, David began expanding Israel's borders through a series of remarkable military victories. In chapter 8, we see how he defeated Israel's traditional enemies in every direction, establishing the kingdom as a regional power. After this, David defeated the Philistines and subdued them, and he took Metheg-ammah from the hands of the Philistines, says verse 1. The Philistines, who had long troubled Israel, were finally subdued. David took control of their main territory, ending the constant threat they posed. Turning eastward, he also defeated the Moabites. He made them lie down on the ground and measured them off with a length of cord. Every 2 lengths of them were put to death, and the 3rd length was allowed to live, according to verse 2. David established dominance over Moab, and the Moabites became subject to David and brought him tribute. Next, David faced a greater threat to the north. David also defeated Hadadezer, son of Rehob, king of Zobah, when he went to restore his monument at the Euphrates River, as stated in verse 3. In this battle, David captured 1,000 of his chariots, 7,000 charioteers, and 20,000 foot soldiers. He hamstrung all but 100 of the chariot horses, as recorded in verse 4. When the Arameans of Damascus came to help Hadadezer, David was undeterred. David struck down 22,000 Arameans. He then put garrisons in Aram of Damascus, and the Arameans became subject to him and brought tribute, according to verses 5 and 6. The text affirms God's favor in these victories. The Lord gave David victory wherever he went. Through these battles, David captured great wealth. David took the gold shields carried by the officers of Hadadezer and brought them to Jerusalem. From Tebah and Berothai, towns of Hadadezer, King David took a great quantity of bronze, as we read in verses 7 and 8. David's fame spread rapidly. When king of Hamath heard that David had defeated the entire army of Hadadezer, he sent his son Joram to King David to greet him and congratulate him on his victory in battle over Hadadezer, says verses 9 and 10. Recognizing the rising regional power, Tou sent gifts of silver, gold, and bronze, seeking to establish an alliance with David. The king of Israel, recognizing that his victories came from the Lord, dedicated to the Lord the silver and gold that he had consecrated from all the nations he had subdued, from Syria, Moab, the Ammonites, the Philistines, Amalek, and from the spoils of Hadadezer, son of Rehob, king of Zobah, as recorded in verses 11 and 12. David also gained fame for his victory over the Edomites. David made a name for himself when he returned after striking down 18,000 Arameans in the Valley of Salt. He stationed garrisons in Edom. Throughout all Edom he placed garrisons, and all the Edomites became David's subjects, according to verses 13 and 14. Once again, the text emphasizes, the Lord gave David victory wherever he went. These military campaigns transformed Israel from a small kingdom constantly under threat into a powerful nation that dominated the region. David's conquests significantly expanded Israel's borders, bringing peace and prosperity to the people. Tribute flowed into Jerusalem, enriching the royal treasury and making it possible to plan projects such as the future temple. More importantly, these victories fulfilled the promise God had made to Abraham centuries earlier to give his descendants all the land from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates. Under David's leadership, Israel finally occupied the full extent of the territory that God had promised to the patriarchs. With the kingdom now expanded and secure, David established an efficient administration to govern Israel. In chapter 8, verse 15, we read that David reigned over all Israel, administering justice and righteousness to all his people. David surrounded himself with capable men to help him govern. Joab, son of Zeruiah, was over the army. Jehoshaphat, son of Ahilud, was recorder. Zadok, son of Ahitub, and Ahimelech, son of Abiathar, were priests. Seraiah was secretary, as stated in verses 16 and 17. The king's security and special missions were entrusted to Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, who was over the Kerethites and Pelethites, as verse 18 records. These were likely foreign mercenaries who formed a royal guard, free from tribal loyalties that might complicate the command of Israelite troops. Rounding out his governing team, David's sons were chief officials, as noted at the end of verse 18. David involved his own family in the administration, following a pattern common in ancient monarchies. This governmental structure represented a significant evolution for Israel. During the time of the judges, the nation had no permanent central administration. Even under Saul, the government remained quite rudimentary. David, however, established a complete administrative system with clear divisions of responsibility. The army, led by Joab, ensured external security and maintained control over conquered territories. Jehoshaphat, the recorder, likely maintained official records and functioned as something of a prime minister. Priests Zadok and Ahimelech oversaw religious affairs, maintaining the vital link between throne and altar in Israel. Seraiah, the secretary, was responsible for official correspondence and royal documents, an essential role in an age when literacy was limited. Benaiah's royal guard ensured the king's security and carried out special missions. David's sons, as chief officials, were trained in leadership and helped extend royal influence. This administrative organization enabled David to effectively govern a territory far larger than any previous Israelite leader. The biblical text stresses that he administered justice and righteousness to all his people, indicating that this structure served not just to glorify the king, but to ensure fair governance for the people. David's administrative wisdom contributed just as much as his military skill to Israel's stability and prosperity. A well-governed kingdom flourished in times of peace and could mobilize resources efficiently in times of war. The system David established became a model followed by the kings of Israel and Judah for generations to come. Amid all his victories and royal duties, David did not forget past promises. In chapter 9, he asks, "Is there still anyone left of the house of Saul to whom I may show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" This question revealed David's heart. Though he was now powerful and his former enemies had been subdued, he remembered his friendship with Jonathan, Saul's son, and the promise they had made to one another. Instead of eliminating potential rivals to the throne, as was typical among kings of the time, David sought to show kindness. A servant of Saul's household named Ziba was brought before the king. When David asked if there was still anyone from Saul's house to whom he could show the kindness of God, Ziba replied, "There is still a son of Jonathan, crippled in his feet," as verse 3 states. David immediately wanted to know where this man was. Ziba informed him that he was in the house of Machir, son of Ammiel, in Lodebar, as in verse 4. Lodebar was beyond the Jordan, far from Jerusalem, suggesting that Mephibosheth was essentially in hiding, fearing that the new king might want to eliminate him. So King David had him brought from the house of Machir, son of Ammiel, at Lodebar, as we read in verse 5. We can imagine the fear Mephibosheth must have felt upon receiving the order to appear before the king. As a descendant of Saul's house, he likely expected the worst. When Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan and grandson of Saul, came before David, he bowed down to pay him honor, as verse 6 records. David then called him by name, Mephibosheth, to which he replied, "At your service." Instead of threats or punishment, Mephibosheth heard astonishing words. "Do not be afraid," David said, "For I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table," as declared in verse 7. Perplexed by such unexpected kindness, Mephibosheth responded humbly, "What is your servant that you should notice a dead dog like me?" As recorded in verse 8, referring to himself as a dead dog, reflected how unworthy and insignificant he felt to receive royal attention. Then David summoned Ziba, Saul's servant, and said to him, "I have given your master's grandson everything that belonged to Saul and his family. You and your sons and your servants are to farm the land for him and bring in the crops, so that your master's grandson may be provided for. But Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, will always eat at my table," as recorded in verses 9 and 10. Ziba, who had 15 sons and 20 servants, pledged to do everything the king had commanded. Thus, Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons, as verse 11 states. The passage also mentions that Mephibosheth had a young son named Micah, and that all who lived in Ziba's household were servants of Mephibosheth. The chapter concludes by noting that Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem because he always ate at the king's table, and he was lame in both feet, as we read in verse 13. This final mention of his physical disability reminds the reader of the man's vulnerability and highlights David's extraordinary generosity. The way David treated Mephibosheth revealed his character beyond military victories and administrative skills. In a time when vengeance and elimination of rivals were the norm, David chose to honor a friendship commitment, showing mercy to a potential rival. Instead of seeing Mephibosheth as a threat, David treated him like a son, giving him a place of honor at his own table. The peace David had secured through military victories would not last forever. In chapter 10, a new crisis emerged when the king of the Ammonites died, and his son Hanun succeeded him as king, according to verse 1. Remembering the kindness the previous king had shown him, David wished to show the same to the new king. David said, "I will show kindness to Hanun, son of Nahash, just as his father showed kindness to me." So David sent envoys to express sympathy to Hanun concerning his father, as stated in verse 2. However, when David's ambassadors arrived in the land of the Ammonites, they were met with suspicion. The Ammonite princes said to Hanun, "Do you think David is honoring your father by sending envoys to express sympathy? Hasn't David sent them to you only to explore the city and spy it out and overthrow it?" As we read in verse 3. Persuaded by these distrustful advisers, Hanun made a decision with serious consequences. He seized David's envoys, shaved off half of each man's beard, cut off their garments at the hips, and sent them away, as stated in verse 4. This was an act of extreme humiliation and a grave diplomatic insult. When David learned what had happened, recognizing how deeply humiliated his men were, he sent messengers to meet them, for they were greatly humiliated. The king said, "Stay in Jericho until your beards have grown back and then return," as recorded in verse 5. This act of consideration shows David's sensitivity to his servants' dignity. Realizing they had deeply offended David, the Ammonites prepared for war. They hired 20,000 Aramean foot soldiers from Beth Rehob and Zobah, as well as the king of Makkah with 1,000 men, and 12,000 men from Tob, as verse 6 notes. This coalition posed a serious threat to Israel. When David heard of it, he sent Joab out with the entire army of fighting men, according to verse 7. The Ammonites positioned themselves at the city gate, while the hired Arameans spread out in the open country, creating a tactical challenge for Joab, who realized that battle lines were drawn before him and behind him, as verse 9 puts it. In a brilliant military maneuver, Joab divided his forces. He selected some of the best troops in Israel and deployed them against the Arameans. The rest of the men he put under the command of Abishai, his brother, to face the Ammonites. as described in verses 9 and 10. Joab then said to his brother, "If the Arameans are too strong for me, you are to come to my rescue. But if the Ammonites are too strong for you, I will come to rescue you." Joab also inspired his troops with stirring words. "Be strong, and let us fight bravely for our people and the cities of our God. The Lord will do what is good in his sight," as we read in verse 12. With this strategy and motivation, Joab and his troops advanced to fight the Arameans, and they fled before him, according to verse 13. Seeing the Arameans flee, the Ammonites also fled before Abishai and went inside the city, as verse 14 recounts. Joab then returned to Jerusalem, ending the first phase of the conflict. But the Arameans were not ready to accept defeat. They regrouped, and this time Hadadezer brought out the Arameans from beyond the Euphrates River. As verse 16 says, "This force assembled at Helam, under the command of Shobach, Hadadezer's army commander. When David heard of this, he personally took charge. He gathered all Israel, crossed the Jordan, and went to Helam, as stated in verse 17. The Arameans formed their lines against David and fought him, but were once again defeated. David and his men killed 700 of their charioteers and 40,000 horsemen. They also struck down Shobach, the commander of their army, and he died there, according to verse 18. This decisive victory had significant political consequences. When all the kings who were vassals of Hadadezer saw that they had been defeated by Israel, they made peace with Israel and became subject to them, as recorded in verse 19. The text concludes by noting that the Arameans were afraid to help the Ammonites anymore. The war against the Ammonites demonstrated not only Israel's military might under David, but also the complexity of international relations at the time. A diplomatic insult triggered a conflict that drew in multiple regional powers. David's victory further solidified Israel's status as a regional force and elevated the king's prestige. In the midst of so many victories and achievements, David would face his greatest failure, not on the battlefield, but within his own character. Chapter 11, verse 1 tells us that, "In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem." This decision to stay behind while his men fought set the stage for a series of tragic events. One evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful, as verse 2 describes. Driven by desire, David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, "She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite." Verse 3. Even knowing she was married and that her husband was away fighting for the kingdom, David sent messengers to get her. She came to him and he slept with her. Verse 4. The text notes that she had purified herself from her uncleanness, indicating she was not pregnant before this encounter. Afterward, the woman conceived and sent word to David, saying, "I am pregnant." Verse 5. The news confronted David with the consequences of his actions, prompting him to quickly devise a plan to cover up his transgression. So David sent this word to Joab, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." Verse 6. When Uriah arrived, David asked him how Joab was, how the soldiers were, and how the war was going, pretending that his interest was merely in receiving news from the front lines. Then David told Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." Verse 8. David even sent a gift after him from the king's table. The king expected Uriah to go home and sleep with his wife, making the pregnancy appear legitimate. But Uriah, showing remarkable integrity, slept at the entrance to the palace with all his master's servants and did not go down to his house. Verse 9. When David heard about it, he asked Uriah, "Haven't you just come from a journey? Why didn't you go home?" Uriah's reply revealed his noble character. The ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents, and my commander Joab and my lord's men are camped in the open country. How could I go to my house to eat and drink and lie with my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing." Verse 11. In a second attempt, David said to Uriah, "Stay here one more day, and tomorrow I will send you back." So David had Uriah eat and drink with him, and he made him drunk, hoping that under the influence of alcohol, the soldier might lower his guard. But even inebriated, in the evening Uriah went out to sleep on his mat among his master's servants. He did not go home. Verse 13. The failure of his plan drove David to commit an even graver sin. The same man who once refused to raise a hand against Saul, the Lord's anointed, now coldly plotted the death of one of his loyal soldiers. This episode with Bathsheba marked a dramatic fall for David. The same man who had shown mercy to Mephibosheth and composed beautiful psalms of praise to God now gave in to lust, adultery, and soon to follow murder. The story serves as a warning of how even people of great faith and character can fall when they lower their guard and give in to temptation. Faced with the failure of his attempts to cover up the affair, David resorted to desperate measures. In chapter 11, verse 14, "In the morning David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it with Uriah. In that letter David gave sinister instructions. Put Uriah in the front line where the fighting is fiercest, then withdraw from him so he will be struck down and die." Verse 15. The cruel irony is that Uriah himself unknowingly carried the very letter that sealed his fate, a tragic testimony to the trust he placed in his king. Joab received the letter and carried out David's orders. So, while Joab had the city under siege, he put Uriah at a place where he knew the strongest defenders were. Verse 16. When the city's soldiers came out to fight, some of the men in David's army fell. Moreover, Uriah the Hittite died. Verse 17. Joab then sent a messenger to report to David about the battle. He instructed the messenger, "After you have given the king this account of the battle, the king's anger may flare up, and he may ask you, 'Why did you get so close to the city to fight? Didn't you know they would shoot arrows from the wall? Who killed Abimelech, son of Jerubesheth? Didn't a woman throw an upper millstone on him from the wall so that he died in Thebez? Why did you get so close to the wall?' If he asks you this, then say to him, 'Moreover, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead.'" Verses 19 to 21. The messenger went and told David everything Joab had instructed him. When he reported Uriah's death, David responded with calculated indifference. "Say this to Joab. Don't let this upset you. The sword devours one as well as another. Press the attack against the city and destroy it." Say this to encourage Joab. Verse 25. When Bathsheba heard that her husband was dead, she mourned for him. Verse 26. After the period of mourning, David had her brought to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. Verse 27. The text ends this episode with a solemn statement. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord. This simple but weighty conclusion makes it clear that although David managed to hide his sin from people, he could not escape divine judgment. David's conspiracy against Uriah reveals the depth of his moral collapse. The man who once spared Saul's life, despite having justification and opportunity, now schemed the death of an innocent and loyal man. David had fallen so far that he used his royal power not to protect his people, but to sacrifice one of them for his own gain. The contrast between Uriah and David in this story is striking. Uriah, even when drunk, held on to his integrity and refused to enjoy the comforts of home while his comrades were at war. David, on the other hand, remained in Jerusalem when he should have been leading his army, and now used his authority to fulfill selfish desires. David's conspiracy shows how one sin can lead to another. What began as a lustful glance became adultery, which led to deceit and finally to murder. Each step in this chain of sin took David further from being a man after God's own heart. This story also illustrates how power can corrupt. David used his authority as king to summon Bathsheba, attempt to manipulate Uriah, and ultimately have him killed. The power meant to serve the people was turned into a weapon to destroy an innocent man. David's plan seemed to have worked. Uriah was dead. Bathsheba was now his wife, and the scandal had been avoided. But God saw everything and would not let the sin go without consequences. In chapter 12, verse 1, the Lord sent Nathan to David. The prophet approached the king with a parable. There were two men in a certain city, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb he had bought. He raised it, and it grew up with him and his children. It shared his food, drank from his cup, and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. As verses 1 to 3 tell us, Nathan continued, "Now a traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who had come to him. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for the one who had come to him," according to verse 4. When David heard this story, he burned with anger against the man and said to Nathan, "As surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this must die." And as we read in verse 5, outraged at the injustice in the parable, David added, "He must pay for that lamb 4 times over, because he did such a thing and had no pity." Then came the moment of confrontation. Nathan said to David, "You are the man," as recorded in verse 7. The prophet then delivered God's message. "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave your master's house to you, and your master's wives into your arms. I gave you all Israel and Judah, and if all this had been too little, I would have given you even more. Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and took his wife to be your own. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites," as verses 7 to 9 recount. Nathan then pronounced divine judgment. "Now, therefore, the sword will never depart from your house, because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own," according to verse 10. And he added, "This is what the Lord says, out of your own household I am going to bring calamity on you. Before your very eyes I will take your wives and give them to one who is close to you, and he will sleep with your wives in broad daylight. You did it in secret, but I will do this thing in broad daylight before all Israel," as verses 11 and 12 declare. Faced with this direct confrontation, David did not try to deny or justify his actions. Instead, he confessed, "I have sinned against the Lord," as stated in verse 13. This sincere, though brief confession showed that David recognized his guilt not just against Uriah, but ultimately against God. Nathan replied, "The Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die. But because by doing this you have shown utter contempt for the Lord, the son born to you will die," according to verses 13 and 14. Divine forgiveness would not erase all the temporal consequences of David's sin. Soon after, the Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife had borne to David, and he became ill, as verse 15 says. Deeply distressed, David pleaded with God for the child. He fasted and spent the nights lying in sackcloth on the ground, as verse 16 recounts. The elders of his household tried to get him up from the ground, but he refused and would not eat. On the 7th day, the child died. David's attendants were afraid to tell him, thinking, "While the child was still alive, we spoke to him, but he would not listen to us. How can we now tell him the child is dead? He may do something desperate," as verse 18 records. But David noticed his attendants whispering and realized the child was dead. When he asked them and they confirmed it, surprisingly, David got up from the ground. After he had washed, put on lotions and changed his clothes, he went into the house of the Lord and worshipped, as stated in verse 20. Then he returned to his own house, asked for food, and ate. His servants, confused by this sudden change in behavior, asked, "Why are you acting this way? While the child was alive, you fasted and wept, but now that the child is dead, you get up and eat," as verse 21 describes. David explained, "While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept. I thought, who knows? The Lord may be gracious to me and let the child live. But now that he's dead, why should I go on fasting? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me," according to verses 22 and 23. This response revealed David's acceptance of God's will and his faith in life after death. The chapter then tells us that David comforted his wife Bathsheba, and he went to her and made love to her. She gave birth to a son, and they named him Solomon. The Lord loved him, as verse 24 says. The text adds that God sent the prophet Nathan to name the child Jedediah, meaning loved by the Lord, showing that divine grace still rested on David's house despite his sin. Nathan's confrontation and its aftermath highlighted both God's justice and his mercy. On the one hand, David would face serious consequences for his actions, a continuing pattern of conflict within his family, as later stories reveal. On the other hand, God did not completely reject David. His sincere repentance was accepted, and God continued to work through him and his lineage. The parable Nathan used to confront David was particularly powerful because it allowed the king to see his own sin clearly, free from the distortions of self-interest and rationalization. In condemning the rich man in the parable, David was, in fact, condemning himself. And when Nathan said, "You are the man," the king could no longer deny his guilt. Psalm 51, traditionally attributed to David after this episode, expresses the depth of his repentance. "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love. Blot out my transgressions according to your great compassion." This heartfelt prayer of contrition shows that despite his fall, David still had a heart sensitive to divine correction. After David sinned with Bathsheba and the sword of divine justice was pronounced upon his house, it didn't take long for the prophecy to begin unfolding. The drama started with Amnon, David's oldest son. In chapter 13, a terrible situation developed within the royal family. Amnon, son of David, fell in love with Tamar, the sister of Absalom, also a child of David. Amnon became so obsessed with his sister Tamar that he made himself ill. She was a virgin, and it seemed impossible for him to do anything to her, say verses 1 and 2. Amnon's sick obsession with his half-sister consumed him. He had a friend named Jonadab, son of Shimeah, David's brother. Jonadab was very shrewd and noticed something was troubling the prince. "Why do you, the king's son, look so dejected morning after morning? Won't you tell me what's going on?" Jonadab asked. Amnon confessed, "I'm in love with Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister." Instead of urging Amnon to restrain his improper desires, Jonadab devised a wicked plan. "Go to bed and pretend to be sick. When your father comes to see you, say to him, 'Please let my sister Tamar come and prepare some food in my sight, so I may watch her and eat it from her hand,'" he advised in verse 5. Amnon followed this advice. When David came to visit him, Amnon asked that Tamar be sent to prepare cakes for him. The king, unaware of his son's intentions, sent word to Tamar, "Go to your brother Amnon's house and prepare something for him to eat." Tamar innocently went to Amnon's house, where he lay in bed. She took some dough, kneaded it, made the cakes in front of him, and baked them. She took the pan and served him, but he refused to eat, say verses 8 and 9. Then Amnon ordered everyone to leave, leaving him alone with Tamar. When she approached with the food, he grabbed her and said, "Come lie with me, my sister." Terrified, Tamar pleaded with him, "No, my brother, don't force me. Such a thing should not be done in Israel. Don't do this wicked thing. What about me? Where could I go to get rid of my disgrace? And you would be like one of the wicked fools in Israel. Please speak to the king. He will not keep me from being yours," as we read in verses 12 and 13. But Amnon, consumed by his sick desire, refused to listen to her, and since he was stronger than she, he raped her, as verse 14 recounts. Right after that horrific act, something even darker happened. Amnon hated her with intense hatred. In fact, he hated her more than he had loved her. His obsession turned to loathing. "Get up and get out," he shouted. Devastated, Tamar replied, "No! Sending me away would be a greater wrong than what you've already done to me." But Amnon wouldn't listen. He called his servant and ordered, "Get this woman out of here and bolt the door after her." Tamar was wearing a long robe, the kind the king's virgin daughters traditionally wore. She put ashes on her head, tore the robe she was wearing, put her hand on her head, and went away, weeping aloud as she went, as verse 19 states. Her brother Absalom saw her and asked, "Has Amnon, your brother, been with you? Be quiet. For now, my sister, he is your brother. Don't take this to heart." So Tamar remained desolate in Absalom's house, while Absalom held on to a simmering hatred for Amnon. When David heard all of this, he was furious, according to verse 21. However, he took no action to punish Amnon, perhaps because Amnon was his firstborn, or because David felt morally compromised due to his own sin with Bathsheba. This family tragedy marked the beginning of the fulfillment of Nathan's prophecy. The sword would never depart from David's house, and evil would rise from within his own family. Amnon's crime against Tamar was only the first in a string of tragedies that would plague the royal house. 2 years passed since Tamar's terrible ordeal, and Absalom patiently waited for the right moment to avenge his sister's honor. While David took no steps to punish Amnon, Absalom carefully planned his revenge. In chapter 13, verse 23, we read, 2 years later, when Absalom's sheep were being sheared at Baal-Hazor near Ephraim, he invited all the king's sons to come. Sheep shearing time was traditionally a festive occasion, a perfect setting for a family gathering. Absalom went to the king and said, "Your servant has shearers. Please let the king and his attendants join me." David declined, not wanting to be a burden on his son, even after Absalom insisted. Then Absalom made a seemingly innocent request. "If you're not coming, then let my brother Amnon come with us." The king asked, "Why should he go with you?" But Absalom kept pressing, and David sent Amnon and the rest of the king's sons with him, as we read in verse 27. The plan was in motion. Absalom ordered his men, "Watch Amnon. When he's in high spirits from drinking wine and I give the signal, then strike him down. Don't be afraid. Haven't I given you this order? Be strong and brave," as verse 28 states. During the banquet, when Amnon was drunk, Absalom's men did to Amnon what Absalom had ordered. Then all the king's sons got up, mounted their mules, and fled, according to verse 29. As the princes made their way back to Jerusalem, a distorted message reached David. Absalom has killed all the king's sons. Not one of them is left. David, overwhelmed, tore his robes and lay on the ground, and all his servants stood by with their clothes torn, as seen in verse 31. Jonadab, the same one who had advised Amnon, then spoke to David. "My lord should not think they killed all the princes. Only Amnon is dead. Absalom has been planning this ever since Amnon raped his sister Tamar," as verses 32 and 33 explain. Soon it was confirmed that only Amnon had died. The rest of the king's sons arrived in Jerusalem, weeping loudly. The king and all his servants also wept very bitterly, as verse 36 recounts. As for Absalom, he fled and went to Talmai, son of Ammihud, the king of Geshur, as verse 37 tells us. Geshur was his mother's homeland, where he would be safe. He stayed there 3 years, while David mourned for his son every day. Over time, David's grief over Amnon faded, and he began longing for Absalom. Absalom's revenge revealed his calculating and relentless nature. He waited patiently for the right moment, carefully planned his actions, and executed his vengeance without hesitation. The cost was steep. He had to flee the kingdom and live in exile, far from his homeland and family. This episode deepened the crisis within the royal family. Amnon, the firstborn and presumed heir to the throne, was dead. Absalom, another key son, was in exile. And David, torn between mourning one son and longing for another, watched helplessly as his family fell apart before his eyes. Fulfilling Nathan's prophecy, Absalom remained in exile in Geshur for 3 years. In Jerusalem, Joab noticed that the king's heart longed for Absalom's return. Chapter 14 tells how Joab devised a plan to bring the prince back. Joab sent to Tekoa and brought a wise woman from there. He said to her, "Pretend to be in mourning. Dress in mourning clothes, don't anoint yourself with oil, and act like a woman who has been grieving for the dead a long time," as we read in verse 2. He instructed her on what to say to the king. 2. Woman from Tekoa went to David, bowed down, and cried out, "Help me, O king." When David asked what troubled her, she told a story about her 2 sons. "Your servant had 2 sons. They fought in the field where there was no one to separate them, and one struck the other and killed him. Now the whole family has risen against your servant. They say, 'Hand over the one who struck his brother so that we may put him to death for the life he took.' If they do that, they'll extinguish my only remaining heir," as she explains in verses 6 and 7. David promised to protect her remaining son. Then the woman revealed the true purpose of her visit. "Why then have you devised such a thing against the people of God?" By saying this, the king convicts himself, for he has not brought back his banished one, as verse 13 says. She continued with a moving reflection. "We must all die. We are like water spilled on the ground, which cannot be gathered up again. But God does not take away life. Instead, he devises ways so that a banished person may not remain estranged from him." From verse 14, David realized Joab was behind it and asked the woman directly. She confirmed, "Your servant Joab gave me these instructions, and it was he who put all these words into the mouth of your servant," as verse 19 recounts. David then summoned Joab and said, "Very well, I will do this. Go, bring back the young man Absalom," as we read in verse 21. Joab thanked him, went to Geshur, and brought Absalom back to Jerusalem, according to verse 23. But his return did not mean full reconciliation. David ordered, "He must go to his own house. He must not see my face." So Absalom went to his own house and did not see the king's face, as verse 24 states. Absalom was remarkable for his appearance. In all Israel, there was no one so praised for his looks as Absalom. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, there was no blemish in him, as verse 25 tells us. His hair was especially impressive. Whenever he cut the hair of his head, he used to cut it once a year because it became too heavy. It weighed 200 shekels by the royal standard, according to verse 26. Absalom had 3 sons and a daughter whom he named Tamar, likely in honor of his sister who had been wronged. She was a beautiful woman, as verse 27 notes. After 2 years in Jerusalem without seeing the king, Absalom grew impatient. He sent messages to Joab asking him to intervene, but Joab refused to come. After being ignored a second time, Absalom told his servants, "Look, Joab's field is next to mine, and he has barley there. Go and set it on fire." And they did. Just that, finally, Joab came to Absalom's house and asked, "Why did your servant set my field on fire?" Absalom replied, "I sent for you and you wouldn't come. I want you to go to the king and ask, 'Why did I come from Geshur? It would have been better for me to stay there. Now I want to see the king's face, and if I'm guilty of anything, let him put me to death," as stated in verse 32. Joab delivered the message, and David summoned Absalom. He came to the king and bowed down with his face to the ground before him, and the king kissed Absalom, as we read in verse 33. On the surface, father and son were reconciled, but as we'll see, Absalom's heart was already plotting betrayal. Absalom's return to Jerusalem was merely a superficial reconciliation. Though he had finally been readmitted into the king's presence, the years of exile and rejection had left deep scars. In Absalom's heart, filial love had been replaced by ambition and resentment, feelings that would soon take shape in action. After being restored to the king's presence, Absalom began to carry out an ambitious plan. In chapter 15, we see how he carefully prepared a conspiracy to seize his father's throne. Absalom got himself a chariot, horses, and 50 men to run ahead of him. As verse 1 says, this show of royal splendor clearly signaled his intentions. His strategy for winning the people's hearts was clever. Absalom would rise early and stand beside the road leading to the city gate. Whenever someone came with a case to be judged by the king, Absalom would call out and ask, "Where are you from?" "Udran," and the person would reply, "Your servant is from such and such a tribe of Israel." Then Absalom would say, "Look, your claims are valid and proper, but there's no representative of the king to hear you," as described in verses 2 and 3. Then he'd make a persuasive promise, "If only I were appointed judge in the land. Then everyone who has a complaint or case could come to me, and I would see that they receive justice," as we read in verse 4. And when someone approached to bow down to him, Absalom would reach out, take hold of him, and kiss him, presenting himself as approachable and warm, unlike the distant image he painted of his father. This is how Absalom treated all the Israelites who came to the king for justice. And so he stole the hearts of the people of Israel, as verse 6 concludes. For 4 years, he worked methodically to build his base of support. When he felt the time was right, Absalom said to the king, "Let me go to Hebron to fulfill a vow I made to the Lord. While your servant was living at Geshur in Aram, I made this vow, if the Lord brings me back to Jerusalem, I will worship him in Hebron," as verses 7 and 8 recount. David, unaware of his son's true intentions, replied, "Go in peace." So Absalom went to Hebron, but he sent messengers throughout all the tribes of Israel with this instruction: "As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, say, 'Absalom is king in Hebron,' as recorded in verse 10. With Absalom went 200 men from Jerusalem who had been invited by him. They went innocently, knowing nothing, says verse 11. He also sent for Ahithophel the Gilonite, David's counselor, from his hometown of Gilo, while he was offering sacrifices. The conspiracy gained strength, and Absalom's following kept growing. As verse 12 recounts, Ahithophel's involvement was a heavy blow to David. This counselor was renowned for his wisdom. The advice Ahithophel gave in those days was like that of one who inquires of God, as described in 2 Samuel 16:23. Some scholars suggest Ahithophel may have been Bathsheba's grandfather, which could explain his bitterness toward David. Soon the news reached David. The hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom. As stated in verse 13, the conspiracy had reached a critical point, and the king had to act swiftly to preserve his life and that of his loyal followers. Absalom's conspiracy marks one of the most bitter chapters in David's life. His own son, whom he had forgiven and welcomed back, now turned against him to seize his throne. Personal betrayal merged with political crisis, creating a dangerous situation for the king. Absalom's strategy was remarkably effective. He identified weaknesses in his father's rule, especially in matters of justice, and presented himself as a better alternative. His striking appearance, combined with charm and generous promises, won over many hearts. He also demonstrated calculated patience, working for years to build his support base before striking. But Absalom's conspiracy was not merely political, it was the culmination of the consequences of David's own sin, as foretold by the prophet. Nathan, evil rose from within the king's own house, threatening to undo everything he had built. When David heard about Absalom's rebellion, he made a surprising decision. Rather than fortifying himself in Jerusalem and resisting the attack, the seasoned warrior chose to retreat, at least for the time being. David said to all his servants who were with him in Jerusalem, "Let us arise and flee, or we will not escape from Absalom. Hurry, or he will overtake us quickly, bring disaster upon us, and strike the city with the edge of the sword," as we read in chapter 15, verse 14. The king's servants responded with loyalty. "Your servants are ready to do whatever our Lord the king decides." So, the king set out with his entire household, but left 10 concubines behind to take care of the palace, says verse 16. David's departure from Jerusalem was a somber procession. The king set out on foot, and all the people followed him. They halted at a distant place, verse 17 notes. His servants marched with him, including the Cherethites and Pelethites, his personal bodyguard, and 600 Gittites who had followed him from Gath. Among them was Ittai the Gittite, commander of these 600 men. Concerned for his well-being, David told him, "Why should you come along with us? Go back and stay with the king, for you are a foreigner and an exile from your homeland. You came only yesterday. Should I now make you wander with us? Go back and take your brothers with you. May mercy and truth be with you," as we read in verses 19 and 20. But Ittai responded with extraordinary loyalty. "As surely as the Lord lives, and as my lord the king lives, wherever my lord the king may be, whether it means life or death, there your servant will be," verse 21 declares. Moved by this devotion, David allowed Ittai and his men to go with him. All the people were weeping loudly as the king passed by. He crossed the Kidron Valley, and all the people moved on toward the wilderness. Verse 23 says, "The priests Zadok and Abiathar were also there, carrying the Ark of the Covenant. But David commanded, 'Take the Ark of God back into the city. If I find favor in the Lord's eyes, he will bring me back and let me see it in his dwelling place again. But if he says, I am not pleased with you, then I am ready. Let him do to me whatever seems good to him,' as found in verses 25 and 26. David also saw a strategic opportunity to keep informants in the city. He said to Zadok, 'Aren't you a seer? Return to the city in peace, you and your son Ahimaaz, and Jonathan son of Abiathar. I'll wait at the fords in the wilderness until word comes from you to inform me,' as noted in verses 27 and 28. So the ark and the priests returned to Jerusalem. David continued up the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went, his head covered, and barefoot. All the people with him covered their heads and wept as they went up, as verse 30 describes. When David learned that Ahithophel was among the conspirators with Absalom, he prayed, "O Lord, turn Ahithophel's counsel into foolishness." At the summit, where people used to worship God, David was met by Hushai the Archite, with his robe torn and dust on his head, mourning the dire situation. Seeing another opportunity, David said to Hushai, "If you go with me, you'll be a burden to me. But if you return to the city and say to Absalom, 'Your Majesty, I will be your servant. I was your father's servant in the past, but now I will be your servant,' then you can help me by frustrating Ahithophel's advice," as we read in verses 33 and 34. David explained that the priests Zadok and Abiathar would be there, and that Hushai could send him information through their sons. So Hushai, David's friend, returned to Jerusalem just as Absalom was entering the city, concludes verse 37. David's flight from Jerusalem represents a moment of deep humiliation. The man who had once conquered the city and made it his capital was now abandoning it, fleeing from his own son. He walked barefoot, weeping, with his head covered in mourning, a dramatic contrast to the victorious David of earlier years. Even in the midst of crisis, David's wisdom as a leader and strategist became evident. He chose not to engage in an urban battle that could destroy Jerusalem and kill many innocent people. Instead, he set up a network of informants within the city to stay updated on Absalom's movements. He also found a way to neutralize the dreaded counsel of Ahithophel. David's flight also revealed who his true friends were. Some, like Ittai, showed extraordinary loyalty, while others, like Ahithophel, betrayed him. This painful separation between the wheat and the chaff allowed David to know who he could truly rely on in a time of crisis. As David fled along the slope of the Mount of Olives, another drama was unfolding in Jerusalem. Absalom had entered the city and taken over the palace, but now he needed to decide his next move. For that, he would turn to two advisors: Ahithophel, David's former counselor who had joined the conspiracy, and Hushai, David's friend who pretended to support Absalom in order to sabotage his plans. In chapter 16, when Absalom asked Ahithophel what he should do, the advice was blunt and scandalous. Sleep with your father's concubines, whom he left to take a care of the palace. Then all Israel will hear that you have made yourself obnoxious to your father, and the hands of everyone with you will be strengthened, as we read in verse 21. This advice had a twisted logic. In ancient culture, taking a king's concubines was a public declaration of seizing his throne. The act would make reconciliation between father and son impossible, thereby strengthening the loyalty of Absalom's followers. So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof, and he slept with his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel, as verse 22 states. Unknowingly, Absalom was fulfilling Nathan's prophecy to David. I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to someone close to you, and he will sleep with your wives in broad daylight. In chapter 17, Ahithophel offered another, decisive plan. Let me choose 12,000 men and set out tonight in pursuit of David. I would attack him while he is weary and weak. I would strike down only the king, as we read in verses 1 and 2. The idea was to act swiftly before David had a chance to regroup and prepare a defense. The plan pleased Absalom, but he also wanted to hear Hushai's opinion, knowing he had. To undermine Ahithophel's plan to save David, Hushai proposed an alternative strategy. This time, the advice Ahithophel has given is not good, Hushai began. You know your father and his men. They are fighters and as fierce as a wild bear robbed of her cubs. Besides, your father is an experienced warrior. He will not spend the night with the troops. As verses 7 and 8 say, Hushai went on, right now he is probably hiding in a cave or some other place. If he attacks and some of your men fall, it will be reported that there has been a slaughter among Absalom's followers. Then even the bravest soldier, whose heart is like the heart of a lion, will melt with fear. For all Israel knows that your father is a mighty warrior and that those with him are valiant, as stated in verses 9 and 10. Then Hushai laid out a different strategy. I advise that all Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, as numerous as the sand on the seashore, be gathered to you, with you yourself leading them into battle. Then we will attack him wherever he may be found, and we will fall on him as dew settles on the ground. Neither he nor any of his men will be left alive, according to verses 11 and 12. This advice appealed to Absalom's vanity, suggesting he personally lead a grand army, and also seemed safer as it allowed for an overwhelming force to be assembled against David. Absalom and all the men of Israel said, the advice of Hushai the Archite is better than that of Ahithophel, as verse 14 notes. The text adds, for the Lord had determined to frustrate the good advice of Ahithophel in order to bring disaster on Absalom. Hushai immediately informed the priests Zadok and Abiathar of what had happened. Ahithophel has advised Absalom and the elders of Israel in such and such a manner, and I have advised in this and that way. Now send a message quickly and tell David, do not spend the night at the wilderness ford, but cross over at once, or the king and everyone with him will be swallowed up. As we read in verses 15 and 16, Jonathan and Ahimaaz, the priest's sons, were waiting at the En Rogel spring on the outskirts of Jerusalem to carry the message to David. A servant girl went to inform them, and they left to deliver the message to the king, for they could not risk being seen entering the city. Says verse 17, but a boy saw them and reported it to Absalom. The two young men fled and hid in the house of a man in Bahurim, who had a well in his courtyard. The man's wife took a covering, spread it over the mouth of the well, and scattered grain on it so that nothing was noticed, as verse 19 says. When Absalom's servants arrived at the house and asked about Jonathan and Ahimaaz, the woman said, they crossed over the brook. The servants searched but found nothing and returned to Jerusalem. After they had gone, Jonathan and Ahimaaz climbed out of the well and went to inform King David, get up and cross the river quickly, for Ahithophel has advised such and such against you, as we read in verse 21. This information was critical. It allowed David to escape before Absalom could reconsider and follow Ahithophel's original plan. David and all the people with him got up and crossed the Jordan. By daybreak, not one was left who had not crossed, according to verse 22. As for Ahithophel, when he saw that his advice had not been followed, he saddled his donkey, set out for his house in his hometown. He put his house in order, and then hanged himself. So he died and was buried in his father's tomb, as verse 23 states. The proud advisor, realizing that the rejection of his plan likely meant Absalom's defeat and his own downfall, chose to take his own life. The battle of counsel between Ahithophel and Hushai was a turning point in Absalom's rebellion. Though no swords or spears were drawn, this battle of minds determined the course of what was to come. Absalom's choice to follow Hushai's advice gave David the crucial time he needed to regroup his forces and prepare a proper defense. This episode also shows how God was working behind the scenes to protect David, using Hushai as an instrument to thwart Ahithophel's good advice. As the biblical text itself puts it, David's prayer on the Mount of Olives, "O Lord, turn Ahithophel's counsel into foolishness," was being answered. After crossing the Jordan River, David arrived in Mahanaim, where he reorganized his forces. David mustered the men who were with him and appointed over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds, as we read in chapter 18, verse 1. He divided the army into 3 groups, a third under the command of Joab, a third under Abishai son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, and a third under Ittai the Gittite, as stated in verse 2. The king declared that he himself would go out with them into battle, but the men persuaded him otherwise. "You must not go out, for if we are forced to flee, they won't care about us. Even if half of us die, they won't care, but you are worth 10,000 of us. It is better that you stay in the city and send us help from there," as verse 3 tells us. David agreed, "I will do whatever seems best to you." He stood beside the city gate as all the troops marched out in units of hundreds and thousands. At that moment, David gave an order that revealed his fatherly heart, even in the midst of rebellion. "Be gentle with the young man Absalom for my sake." All the commanders heard the king give this command concerning Absalom. So the army marched into the field to fight Israel, and the battle took place in the forest of Ephraim, as verse 6 states. The text describes a brutal conflict. There, Israel's troops were defeated by David's men, and the casualties that day were great, 20,000 men. The battle spread out over the whole countryside, and the forest swallowed up more men that day than the sword, as verses 7 and 8 explain. This detail suggests that the difficult terrain of the forest claimed many of Absalom's inexperienced troops. In the midst of this chaos, a fateful encounter occurred. Absalom happened to meet David's men. He was riding his mule, and as the mule went under the thick branches of a large oak, Absalom's head got caught in the tree. He was left hanging in mid-air, while the mule he was riding kept going, as described in verses 9 and 10. A man saw what happened and went to report it to Joab. I saw Absalom hanging in an oak tree. Joab was furious. What? You saw him? Why didn't you strike him down right there? I would have given you 10 shekels of silver and a warrior's belt, as we read in verses 10 and 11. But the man replied with integrity, even if 1,000 shekels were weighed out into my hands, I would not lay a hand on the king's son. We all heard the king command you, Abishai and Ittai, protect the young man Absalom for my sake, as verse 12 recounts. He added that if he had killed Absalom, Joab himself would have turned him in to the king. Joab responded, I'm not going to waste time like this with you. Taking 3 javelins in his hand, he plunged them into Absalom's heart, while Absalom was still alive in the oak tree, as recorded in verse 14. Then 10 of Joab's armor-bearers surrounded Absalom and finished him off. Joab then sounded the trumpet, and the troops stopped pursuing Israel because Joab halted them. They took Absalom, threw him into a big pit in the forest, and piled up a large heap of stones over him. Meanwhile, all the Israelites fled to their homes, as verse 17 narrates. It's ironic that Absalom, so proud of his looks, especially his hair, met his end because of it. It's also tragic that during his life, he had erected a monument for himself in the King's Valley, saying, I have no son to preserve the memory of my name. Now, instead of a glorious memorial, he had a heap of stones over him, a mark of disgrace. The battle in the forest of Ephraim was decisive. With Absalom's death, the rebellion lost both its leader and its driving force. The Israelite troops, hastily assembled and lacking the experience of David's veterans, were no match for the seasoned warriors of the king, especially in such a challenging terrain. Joab, though directly disobeying David's command to spare Absalom, acted with the pragmatic ruthlessness that had always defined him. In his view, Absalom's death was necessary to end the rebellion once and for all, and to prevent further bloodshed. Still, as we'll see next, his decision would cause deep anguish for the king. With Absalom dead and the battle decided, it was time to bring word to King David, who waited anxiously in Mahanaim. Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, asked Joab for permission to run and deliver the good news to the king, but Joab hesitated. You are not the bearer of news today. You may take news another day. Today you shall not deliver the news, because the king's son is dead, as stated in chapter 18, verse 20. Instead, he ordered a Cushite, Go, tell the king what you have seen. The man bowed before Joab and ran off. Still, Ahimaaz insisted, Whatever happens, let me run behind the Cushite. When Joab asked why he wanted to go, Ahimaaz didn't give a clear answer. He simply repeated his desire to run. At last, Joab relented. Run! So Ahimaaz took the plain route and outran the Cushite. David was sitting between the 2 city gates. The watchman on the roof above the gate looked out and saw a man running alone, as verse 24 recounts. He called out and reported it to the king. If he's alone, he must be bringing news, David said. As the man came closer, the watchman saw another runner and called out to the gatekeeper, Look, another man running alone. The king said, He too must be bringing news. The watchman recognized the first runner. It seems to me that the running of the first one is like that of Ahimaaz, son of Zadok. David replied, He is a good man and comes with good news. As we read in verse 27, Ahimaaz arrived first and greeted the king. Peace. He bowed with his face to the ground and said, Blessed be the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who raised their hand against my lord the king, as it says in verse 28. David asked anxiously, Is the young man Absalom safe? Ahimaaz answered evasively, I saw a great commotion when Joab sent the king's servant and me, your servant, but I do not know what it was about, as we read in verse 29. It seems that Ahimaaz knew of Absalom's death but did not want to be the one to bring the news to the king. David told Ahimaaz to stand aside, and just then the Cushite arrived and said, "Good news for my lord the king. The Lord has avenged you today of all who rose up against you," as it says in verse 31. Once again, David asked, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" This time, the Cushite answered directly, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you to do harm be like that young man," as it says in verse 32. This indirect response confirmed Absalom's death. David's reaction was one of deep anguish. The king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he walked, he cried, "O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died in your place. O Absalom, my son," as verse 33 recounts. News of the king's grief spread through the troops. Joab was told, "The king is weeping and mourning for Absalom," as we read in chapter 19, verse 1. What should have been a day of victory for David's army turned into a day of mourning. The victory that day was turned into mourning for all the people, because on that day they were told, "The king is grieving for his son," as verse 2 says. The people entered the city stealthily, as people who are ashamed steal away when they flee in battle, as we read in verse 3. Meanwhile, the king covered his face and cried out with a loud voice, "O my son Absalom! O Absalom, my son, my son!" Joab, seeing how the king's reaction was affecting troop morale, went to confront him. "Today you have shamed all your servants, those who saved your life and the lives of your sons and daughters, your wives and concubines, by loving those who hate you and hating those who love you. You have made it clear today that commanders and soldiers mean nothing to you," as verses 5 and 6 state. Joab continued with a harsh warning. "I see that if Absalom were alive today and all of us were dead, it would have pleased you well. Now go out and speak encouragingly to your men. I swear by the Lord that if you don't go out, not a man will remain with you tonight. This will be worse for you than all the calamities that have come on you from your youth till now," as we read in verses 7 and 8. Faced with this reality, David rose and sat in the gate. When the people were told the king was sitting at the gate, they all came before him, as verse 8 says. The immediate crisis was resolved, but David's sorrow over the loss of his son would never fade. Absalom's death and David's reaction reveal the personal and familial depth of the tragedy. Beyond the political rebellion and the military battle, this was the story of a father who lost a son he loved, despite all his son's faults. David's lament, "If only I had died in your place, Absalom, my son," expresses not just sorrow, but also guilt and regret. David likely reflected on how his own failures as a father and a man contributed to the tragedy. His sin with Bathsheba, his failure to discipline Amnon after the rape of Tamar, and his prolonged estrangement from Absalom after his exile, all these events paved the way to this devastating outcome. Absalom's death marked the end of the rebellion, but not the end of the consequences of David's sin. As Nathan had prophesied, the sword would never depart from his house, and more conflicts would arise throughout his reign. Absalom's story remains a powerful reminder of how a chain of unresolved sins and resentments can lead to devastating consequences for families and entire nations. Though Absalom's death ended the rebellion, it created a new crisis. The people of Israel were divided and uncertain. In chapter 19, we see David beginning to take steps to restore his reign and return to the capital. All the people throughout the tribes of Israel were arguing among themselves, saying, "The king rescued us from the hand of our enemies and saved us from the hand of the Philistines. But now he has fled the land because of Absalom. Absalom, whom we anointed to rule over us, has died in battle. So why are we not talking about bringing the king back?" Would be as we read in verses 9 and 10. Noticing the people's hesitation, David sent a message to the priests Zadok and Abiathar. Say to the elders of Judah, why should you be the last to bring the king back to his house? The word of all, Israel has reached the king. You are my relatives, my own flesh and blood. So why should you be the last to bring back the king? As verses 11 and 12 say. David also made a special gesture toward Amasa, who had been the commander of Absalom's army. Say to Amasa, are you not my flesh and blood? May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if you are not the commander of my army for life in place of Joab, as we read in verse 13. This was a strategic move to win over Absalom's former supporters and also to sideline Joab, who had killed Absalom against David's orders. The plan worked. He won over the hearts of all the men of Judah as though they were one man. They sent word to the king, return you and all your men, as verse 14 says. The king began his journey back, reaching the Jordan River. The men of Judah went to Gilgal to meet him and help him cross. Shimei, son of Gera, the Benjaminite who had cursed David as he fled Jerusalem, hurried down with the men of Judah to meet the king. He brought with him 1,000 men from Benjamin, along with Ziba, the steward of Saul's house, and Ziba's 15 sons and 20 servants. They all crossed the Jordan ahead of the king to assist in bringing the royal household over. As David was crossing over, Shimei fell before him and pleaded, "May my lord not hold me guilty, or remember the wrong your servant did on the day my lord the king left Jerusalem. May the king not take it to heart, for your servant knows that he sinned. That is why I have come today, the first from the whole house of Joseph, to meet my lord the king," as we read in verses 19 and 20. Abishai, son of Zeruiah and brother of Joab, wanted to kill Shimei. "Shouldn't Shimei be put to death for cursing the Lord's anointed?" he asked. But David replied, "What do you and I have in common, you sons of Zeruiah, that you should become my adversaries today? Should anyone be put to death in Israel today, don't I know that today I am king over Israel?" as seen in verses 21 and 22. And David swore to Shimei that he would not kill him. Mephibosheth, Saul's grandson, also came down to meet the king. He had not taken care of his feet, trimmed his beard, or washed his clothes from the day the king left until the day he returned in peace. When David asked why he hadn't come with him, Mephibosheth replied, "My lord the king, my servant deceived me. I said, I will saddle a donkey so I can ride it and go with the king, for your servant is lame. But he has slandered your servant to my lord the king." As stated in verses 26 and 27, Mephibosheth was referring to Ziba, who had told David that Mephibosheth hoped to reclaim his grandfather's kingdom amid the turmoil. In haste and without thorough investigation, David had given Ziba all of Mephibosheth's possessions. Now realizing he may have been misled, David said, "You and Ziba are to divide the land," as in verse 29. But Mephibosheth, proving his loyalty, replied, "Let him take it all now that my lord the king has returned safely to his palace." Barzillai the Gileadite, an elderly man who had supported David with supplies during his flight, also came to escort the king across the Jordan. Out of gratitude, David invited him, "Come over with me and stay in Jerusalem, and I will take care of you." But Barzillai, now 80 years old, declined. "How many more years will I live that I should go up with the king to Jerusalem? I am now 80. Can I tell the difference between good and bad? Can your servant enjoy food and drink? Can I still hear the voices of male and female singers? Why should your servant be a burden to my lord the king?" As we read in verses 34 and 35, instead, he suggested, "Let your servant return, that I may die in my own town near the tomb of my father and mother. But here is your servant Kimham. Let him cross over with my lord the king. Do for him whatever you wish," as verse 37 says. David agreed and took Kimham with him, promising to do for him whatever Barzillai desired. When the king crossed the Jordan, he kissed Barzillai and blessed him, and the old man returned to his home. Then a dispute arose. The men of Israel asked the men of Judah, Why did our brothers, the men of Judah, secretly take the king and his household across the Jordan, along with all his men? As in verse 41. The men of Judah replied, "Because the king is closely related to us. Why are you angry? Have we eaten at the king's expense? Has he given us any gifts?" But the men of Israel responded, "We have 10 shares in the king. So, we have more claim on David than you. Why did you treat us with contempt? Were we not the first to speak of bringing back our king?" As in verse 43. The heated exchange showed that though David was returning to the throne, the divisions among Israel's tribes remained deeply rooted. Despite these tensions, David managed to return to Jerusalem and reclaim his throne. On this journey, he showed both strength and mercy, pardoning enemies like Shimei, resolving disputes such as the one between Mephibosheth and Sheba, and honoring loyal friends like Barzillai. These qualities helped restore his authority, but the rift between the northern tribes and Judah would remain a persistent challenge. Hardly had David returned to his throne when a new threat emerged. The ongoing tensions between Israel's northern tribes and the tribe of Judah created fertile ground for yet another rebellion. In chapter 20, now a troublemaker named Sheba, son of Bichri, a Benjamite, happened to be there. He sounded the trumpet and shouted, "We have no share in David, no part in Jesse's son, every man to his tent, Israel," as it says in verse 1. The reaction was swift and troubling. So, all the men of Israel deserted David to follow Sheba, son of Bichri. But the men of Judah stayed by their king all the way from the Jordan to Jerusalem, as seen in verse 2. Back in his palace, David addressed a sensitive domestic matter. The 10 concubines he had left to care for the house, whom Absalom had publicly taken, he confined them in a guarded house, providing for them but no longer going into them. They lived in seclusion till the day of their death, as if widows, according to verse 3. With that settled, David turned his attention to Sheba's revolt. He instructed Amasa, his new army commander, "Summon the men of Judah to come to me within 3 days, and be here yourself," as verse 4 recounts. David was fulfilling his promise to appoint Amasa in Joab's place. But Amasa went to summon Judah, but he took longer than the time the king had set for him, as we read in verse 5. Concerned by the delay, David told Abishai, "Now Sheba, son of Bichri, will do us more harm than Absalom did. Take your master's men and pursue him, or he will find fortified cities and escape from us," as in verse 6. So Joab's men, though officially under Abishai's command, along with the Kerethites, Pelethites, and all the mighty warriors, left Jerusalem to pursue Sheba. When they reached the great stone in Gibeon, Amasa came out to meet them. Joab was wearing his military tunic, and strapped over it at his waist was a sword in its sheath. As he stepped forward, it dropped out, as in verse 8. This seemingly minor detail would prove critical. Joab greeted Amasa, "How are you, my brother?" and took hold of Amasa's beard with his right hand to kiss him, as in verse 9. But this friendly gesture concealed deadly intent. Amasa was not on guard against the dagger in Joab's hand, and Joab plunged it into his belly, spilling his intestines to the ground. Without striking him again, Amasa died, as verse 10 tells us. Joab had murdered his cousin Amasa, just as he had previously killed Abner years earlier, eliminating yet another rival for command of the army. Without wasting time, Joab and Abishai, his brother, pursued Sheba, the son of Bichri, as we read in verse 10. One of Joab's men stood by Amasa's body and proclaimed, "Whoever favors Joab and is for David, follow Joab," as stated in verse 11. Seeing that everyone who passed by stopped to look at the corpse, the man removed Amasa from the road to the field and threw a garment over him, because he saw that everyone who came upon the body stopped, as verse 12 recounts. Joab and his men pursued Sheba throughout the territory of Israel until they reached the city of Abel-Beth-Maachah in the far north. There, they besieged Sheba, built a siege ramp against the city so that it stood against the outer wall, and all the troops with Joab battered the wall to bring it down, according to verse 15. At this critical moment, a wise woman from the city cried out, "Listen, tell Joab to come here so I can speak to him," as we read in verse 16. When Joab approached, she asked, "Are you Joab?" He answered, "I am." Then she said, "Listen to the words of your servant." Joab replied, "I'm listening." The woman then said, "In the past people used to say, 'Let them ask advice at Abel,' and that's how disputes were settled. I am one of the peaceful and faithful in Israel. You are trying to destroy a city that is a mother in Israel. Why would you swallow up the Lord's inheritance?" As recorded in verses 18 and 19, Joab answered, "Far be it from me to devour or destroy. That's not the case. But a man named Sheba, son of Bichri, from the hill country of Ephraim, has lifted his hand against King David. Hand over this one man, and I will withdraw from the city," as we read in verses 20 and 21, showing great wisdom and diplomatic skill. The woman said to Joab, "His head will be thrown to you over the wall." She went to the people with her wise counsel, and they cut off the head of Sheba, son of Bichri, and threw it to Joab, as verse 22 tells us. With the threat eliminated, Joab sounded the trumpet, and all the troops dispersed from the city, each to his own home. And Joab returned to the king in Jerusalem. As verse 22 continues, the chapter ends with a list of David's officials, showing that order had been restored. Joab was over the entire army of Israel. Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, was over the Kerethites and Pelethites. Adoniram was in charge of forced labor. Jehoshaphat, son of Ahilud, was the recorder. Sheba was the secretary. Zadok and Abiathar were priests. And Ira the Jairite was also a priest of David, according to verses 23 through 26. Sheba's revolt, though less significant than Absalom's, highlighted how tribal tensions were still very much alive in Israel. The speed with which the northern tribes abandoned David revealed that many Israelites didn't feel fully represented by his government. The episode also revealed the darker side of Joab, who didn't hesitate to kill Amasa to regain control of the army. At the same time, it highlighted the wisdom of an anonymous woman who, with carefully chosen words, saved her city from destruction and ended a conflict that could have sparked another civil war. Sometime later, Israel faced a severe crisis. In chapter 21, we read that there was a famine during the days of David for 3 consecutive years, so David sought the Lord, as verse 1 states. The persistence of the famine suggested that it wasn't merely a natural problem, but one that required a spiritual response. When David inquired of the Lord, he received a surprising answer. "It is because of Saul and his blood-stained house, because he put the Gibeonites to death," as verse 1 continues. This incident isn't recorded elsewhere in the Bible, but evidently Saul had broken the ancient covenant Joshua had made with the Gibeonites. The Gibeonites were a people who had lived in the land before Israel's conquest. They had deceived Joshua by pretending to come from a distant land, thereby securing a peace treaty. Even after the truth was revealed, Joshua honored the oath not to attack them, though he assigned them to be woodcutters and water carriers for the Israelites. The king summoned the Gibeonites and spoke to them, as verse 2 says. David explained that he was seeking a way to make atonement for the wrong Saul had committed, so that they might bless the Lord's inheritance, that is, the people of Israel. The Gibeonites replied, "It's not a matter of silver or gold between us and Saul or his house, nor is it for us to put anyone to death in Israel," as we read in verse 4. But David insisted, "Whatever you say, I will do for you." Then they requested, from the man who tried to destroy us and who schemed to eliminate us so we would have no place anywhere in Israel, let 7 of his descendants be given to us to be executed before the Lord at Gibeah of Saul, the Lord's chosen one, as verses 5 and 6 state. David said, I will give them. But the king spared Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, because of the Lord's oath that was between David and Jonathan, son of Saul, as verse 7 recounts. Instead, the king took the 2 sons of Rizpah, whom she bore to Saul, along with the 5 sons of Merab, Saul's daughter, whom she bore to Adriel, and handed them over to the Gibeonites, as stated in verse 8. The Gibeonites executed them on the mountain before the Lord, as we read in verse 9. It was the beginning of the barley harvest, indicating this happened in the spring. Rizpah, the mother of 2 of the executed men, performed an extraordinary act of devotion. She took sackcloth and spread it out for herself on a rock from the beginning of the harvest until the rain poured down from the heavens. She did not allow the birds of the air to touch them by day, nor the wild animals by night, as verse 10 says. For months, she protected the bodies of the dead from scavengers in a poignant act of mourning and maternal love. When David learned what Rizpah had done, he went and retrieved the bones of Saul and Jonathan his son from the citizens of Jabesh-Gilead, who had stolen them from the public square at Beth-shan, where the Philistines had hung them after killing Saul in Gilboa, as verse 12 recounts. David brought back the bones of Saul and Jonathan, along with the bones of those who had been hanged. They buried the bones of Saul and his son Jonathan in the land of Benjamin, at Zelah in the tomb of Kish his father, as verse 14 recounts. The text adds, they did everything the king commanded. After that, God responded favorably to the land. The famine in Israel ended after this act of atonement, which restored the justice that had been broken by Saul's actions against the Gibeonites. This episode highlights an important biblical principle. The sins of previous generations, especially those involving broken covenants, can affect an entire nation until they are properly addressed. It also reflects David's deep respect for oaths. He honored his promise to Jonathan by sparing Mephibosheth, while also acknowledging the legitimacy of the older oath Israel had sworn to the Gibeonites. Rizpah's maternal devotion moved David deeply, prompting him to ensure a proper burial, not only for the executed men, but also for Saul and Jonathan, whose remains had not yet received a dignified interment in their homeland. This compassionate act marked the formal end of Saul's era and symbolized David's reconciliation with that painful chapter in Israel's history. Although David's reign was nearing its end, the old warrior still had to confront Israel's traditional enemies. In chapter 21, we read of 4 battles against the Philistines, with a focus on confrontations involving the giants of Gath. The Philistines again made war against Israel. David went down with his men and fought the Philistines, as verse 15 says. The text notes that David grew weary during the battle, a clear indication that the king was now advanced in age and no longer had the vigor of his youth. At this vulnerable moment, Ishbi-Benob, one of the descendants of the giants whose spearhead weighed 300 shekels of bronze and who was armed with a new sword, sought to kill David, as verse 16 tells us. The king was in grave danger, but Abishai, son of Zeruiah, came to David's aid, struck the Philistine, and killed him, according to verse 17. This incident prompted David's men to make a solemn vow, "Never again will you go out with us to battle, so that the lamp of Israel will not be extinguished." They understood that David's life was too precious to risk on the battlefield. Still, the war with the Philistines went on. After this, there was another battle with the Philistines. At Gob, Zibekai the Hushathite killed Saph, who was one of the descendants of the giants, says verse 18. Verse 19 continues, "There was another battle with the Philistines at Gob, And Elhanan son of Jaare-Oregim the Bethlehemite struck down Goliath the Gittite, whose spear shaft was like a weaver's beam. This verse has sparked debate among scholars, as it seems to mention another giant named Goliath, or possibly a relative of the famous Goliath, whom David had killed in his youth. Then verse 20 recounts, "There was yet another battle at Gath, where there was a man of great stature, who had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in all. He too was descended from the giants. When this warrior challenged Israel, Jonathan, son of Shimea, David's brother, killed him," as verse 21 states. The passage concludes with verse 22. "These 4 were descendants of Rapha in Gath, and they fell at the hands of David and his men." Rapha appears to refer to a lineage of giants from Gath, known for producing exceptionally large and powerful Philistine warriors. These battles demonstrate that even toward the end of his reign, David and his men continued to defeat Israel's enemies. The victory over the giants of Gath was especially meaningful, echoing David's first great triumph over Goliath when he was just a young shepherd. We also see a clear transition in military leadership. David, the great champion of Israel, was now stepping aside for a new generation of warriors: Abishai, Sibbecai, Elhanan, and Jonathan. These men had been formed and trained under David, and they would continue to defend Israel even after he could no longer lead them into battle. The moment when David is rescued by Abishai shows both the vulnerability and the irreplaceable value of the king. He was no longer the invincible warrior of his youth, but his importance to the nation was so great that his men could not allow him to risk his life again. As they said, he was the lamp of Israel, a guiding light that must not be extinguished. The specific mention of the defeated giants underscores a powerful message. Even Israel's greatest fears, symbolized by these massive, formidable warriors, could be overcome with courage, skill, and faith. The same God who gave young David victory over Goliath continued to empower Israel against its most terrifying foes. After so many battles, dangers, and trials throughout his life, David expressed his gratitude to God in a beautiful song preserved. In chapter 22, this psalm also appears, with slight variations, as Psalm 18 in the book of Psalms. David sang to the Lord the words of this song when the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. As verse 1 says, the song begins with a powerful declaration of love and trust in God. "The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer. My God is my rock, in whom I take refuge, my shield, the horn of my salvation, my stronghold, my refuge and my Savior. From violent people you save me." As seen in verses 2 and 3, David goes on to describe how he called on God in moments of danger. "I called to the Lord, who is worthy of praise, and have been saved from my enemies," says verse 4. He uses poetic language to depict the peril he faced. "The waves of death swirled about me, the torrents of destruction overwhelmed me, the cords of the grave coiled around me. The snares of death confronted me," as we read in verses 5 and 6. In his distress, David cried out to the Lord. "In my distress I called to the Lord, I called out to my God. From his temple he heard my voice, my cry came to his ears." As verse 7 proclaims, he described God's response as a theophany, a majestic and terrifying divine manifestation. "Then the earth shook and trembled, the foundations of the heavens quaked and were shaken, because he was angry," as we read. In verse 8, smoke went up from his nostrils, and devouring fire from his mouth. Coals were kindled by it. He bowed the heavens and came down, and darkness was under his feet, as verses 9 and 10 say. In the following verses, David portrayed the Lord as a divine warrior coming to his aid, riding on a cherub, thundering his voice from the heavens, shooting arrows of lightning to scatter the enemies, laying bare the depths of the sea and the foundations of the earth with his mighty breath. Then David described his own rescue. He reached down from on high and took hold of me. He drew me out of many waters. He rescued me from my powerful enemy, from those who hated me, for they were too strong for me, as verses 17 and 18 say. The king attributed his deliverance entirely to God's goodness. For you are my lamp, O Lord. The Lord turns my darkness into light. With your help I can advance against a troop. With my God I can scale a wall, as we read in verses 29 and 30. David exalted the perfection of God's ways. As for God, his way is perfect. The word of the Lord is proven. He is a shield to all who take refuge in him. For who is God except the Lord? And who is a rock except our God? As verses 31 and 32 state. The king acknowledged that his strength came from God. It is God who arms me with strength and makes my way perfect. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer and sets me securely on the heights, as we read in verses 33 and 34. He trains my hands for battle. My arms can bend a bow of bronze, as verse 35 says. David recalled his victories over his enemies, always giving credit to God. I pursued my enemies and destroyed them. I did not turn back until they were consumed. I crushed them, and they could not rise. They fell beneath my feet. As verses 38 and 39 tell us, the song continues with David recognizing that God delivered him from disputes among the people and preserved him as the head of nations. Foreigners submit to me. As soon as they hear me, they obey, as verses 44 and 45 say. David concluded his psalm with a final praise. The Lord lives, blessed be my rock. May God, the rock of my salvation, be exalted. It is God who avenges me and brings nations under me, as we read in verses 47 and 48. Therefore I will praise you, O Lord, among the nations. I will sing praises to your name. He gives great victories to his king and shows steadfast love to his anointed, to David and his descendants forever, as verses 50 and 51 affirm. This song of gratitude reveals David's heart as a worshipper. After a life full of highs and lows, he did not boast in his own achievements, but recognized God as the source of all his victories. The psalm blends personal memories with poetic imagery to express David's experience of God as his protector and deliverer. The military imagery in the psalm, shield, fortress, bronze bow, defeated enemies, reflects David's life as a warrior. But he transformed these experiences into spiritual metaphors, showing that his physical battles had a spiritual dimension. In every conflict, he saw the hand of God working to protect him and give him victory. The song also reveals David's view of his own role in history. As Israel's anointed king, he saw himself as an instrument of God, fulfilling a divine purpose that would extend through his descendants forever, a reference to God's promise of an eternal dynasty. As he approached the end of his life, David left a spiritual legacy, not only through his psalms, but also in his final recorded words. In chapter 23, we find what the text calls the last words of David, a kind of poetic testament from the king. These are the last words of David. The declaration of David, son of Jesse, the declaration of the man exalted by the Most High, the man anointed by the God of Jacob, Israel's sweet psalmist, as verse 1 says. This verse establishes David's authority as God's chosen king and as the beloved author of Israel's psalms. David acknowledged the divine source of his words. The Spirit of the Lord spoke through me. His word was on my tongue. The God of Israel spoke. The Rock of Israel said to me, as we read in verses 2 and 3. He was not merely sharing human wisdom, but divine revelation. The heart of his message concerned the nature of righteous leadership. He who rules over people justly, who rules in the fear of God, is like the morning light when the sun rises, a morning without clouds, like the brightness after rain that brings grass from the earth, as verses 3 and 4 express. David set the ideal standard for leadership, a rule marked by justice and reverence for God, bringing light and life like sunshine after the rain. He then reflected on his own household and the covenant God had made with him. Though my house is not such with God, yet he has made with me an everlasting covenant, ordered and secured in every part. Will he not bring to fruition my salvation and grant me every desire? As we read in verse 5, even acknowledging the imperfections in his family, David clung to God's promise of an eternal dynasty. In contrast to righteous rulers, David described the fate of the wicked. But the worthless are all like thorns that are thrown away, for they cannot be picked up with the hand. Whoever touches them must be armed with iron and the shaft of a spear. They are completely burned where they lie, as verses 6 and 7 declare. This vivid image reveals the judgment awaiting those who reject God's just rule. After these poetic words, chapter 23 continues with a list of David's mighty men, a record of the king's most distinguished warriors. This list begins with the three, namely Josheb, Basshebeth, Eleazar, and Shammah, whose extraordinary deeds are described in detail. One particularly touching episode involves a simple longing expressed by David that turned into an act of remarkable bravery. David was in the stronghold and he longed for water. He said, "Oh, that someone would get me a drink of water from the well near the gate of Bethlehem." And then, as we read in verse 15, it was nothing more than a nostalgic sigh, not a command. Yet the three mighty warriors broke through the Philistine lines, drew water from the well near the gate of Bethlehem, and brought it back to David. As verse 16 tells us, they risked their lives just to satisfy the king's wistful desire. David's response revealed his character, but he refused to drink it. Instead, he poured it out before the Lord. "Far be it from me, Lord, to do this," he said. "Is it not the blood of men who went at the risk of their lives?" Then David would not drink it, as recorded in verses 16 and 17. To David, the water was too precious to consume. It symbolized the blood of those who had risked their lives, and so he offered it as a libation to the Lord. The chapter goes on to describe the exploits of other mighty warriors, including Abishai, Joab's brother, who raised his spear against 300 men whom he killed, and so he became as famous as the three, as noted in verse 18, and Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, who struck down 2 of Moab's best men. He also went down into a pit on a snowy day and killed a lion, according to verse 20. He also struck down a huge Egyptian. Although the Egyptian had a spear in his hand, Benaiah went against him with a club. He snatched the spear from the Egyptian's hand and killed him with his own spear, as we read in verse 21. In total, the list includes 37 mighty men, concluding with Uriah the Hittite. There were 37 in all, as verse 39 records. The inclusion of Uriah, the husband of Bathsheba, whom David had killed, is a solemn reminder of David's moral failures amidst his great achievements. David's final words, along with the list of his mighty men, serve as a kind of testament to his life as king. His words reflect his vision of just leadership, his faith in the divine covenant, and his certainty about judgment upon evil. The list of mighty men demonstrates how he inspired fierce loyalty in extraordinary individuals who performed heroic deeds on his behalf and for Israel. The end of David's reign was marked by one last tragic episode, a mistake with devastating consequences. In chapter 24, the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, "Go and take a census of Israel and Judah," as we read in verse 1. This verse is striking, as it suggests that God incited David to do something that would later be considered sinful. In First Chronicles 21:1, the same event is attributed to Satan. One way to reconcile this is to see that God allowed Satan to tempt David, or that God used the pride already in David's heart to bring about an action that would expose that sin. The King said to Joab, the army commander with him, "Go throughout the tribes of Israel from Dan to Beersheba, and enroll the fighting men, so that I may know how many there are." As verse 2 tells us, this desire to count the people seemed to stem from pride or a reliance on numbers rather than on God. Joab questioned the decision. "May the Lord your God multiply the troops 100 times over, and may the eyes of my lord the king see it. But why does my lord the king want to do such a thing?" as we read in verse 3. Even Joab, not known for spiritual insight, recognized something was wrong. But the king's word, however, overruled Joab and the army commanders, as verse 4 says. So Joab and the army officers left the king's presence to enroll the fighting men of Israel. The operation was extensive, spanning all of Israel. They crossed the Jordan and camped near Aroer, south of the town in the gorge, and then went through Gad and on to Jazer, as in verse 5. From there they moved through Gilead, the land of Tahtim Hodshi, to Dan, and the region around Sidon. They passed through the fortress of Tyre and all, the towns of the Hivites and Canaanites, and eventually reached the southernmost part of Judah at Beersheba. After they had gone through the entire land, they came back to Jerusalem at the end of 9 months and 20 days. According to verse 8, Joab then reported the results to the king. In Israel, there were 800,000 able-bodied men who could handle a sword, and in Judah 500,000, as verse 9 says. But after receiving the report, David was conscience-stricken after he had counted the fighting men, as we read in verse 10. He admitted his guilt. "I have sinned greatly in what I have done. Now, Lord, I beg you, take away the guilt of your servant. I have done a very foolish thing." The next morning, the word of the Lord came to Gad the prophet, David's seer, as in verse 11. God instructed Gad to offer David 3 choices of punishment. "I am giving you 3 options. Choose one of them for me to carry out against you," as verse 12 states. Gad came to David and laid out the options. "Shall there come on you 3 years of famine in your land? Or 3 months of fleeing from your enemies while they pursue you? Or 3 days of plague in your land? Now then, think it over and decide how I should answer the one who sent me," as recorded in verse 13. David chose to fall into the hands of God rather than man. "I am in deep distress. Let us fall into the hands of the Lord, for his mercy is great, but do not let me fall into human hands," as we see in verse 14. So the Lord sent a plague on Israel from that morning until the end of the time designated, and 70,000 of the people from Dan to Beersheba died. As verse 15 says, the plague was halted only when the angel stretched out his hand to destroy Jerusalem. But the Lord relented concerning the disaster and said to the angel who was afflicting the people, "Enough, withdraw your hand," as we read in verse 16. At that moment, the angel was standing at the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. David saw the angel and prayed, "I have sinned. I, the shepherd, have done wrong. These sheep, what have they done? Let your hand fall on me and my family," as we read in verse 17. He personally took responsibility for the suffering of the people. That same day, Gad came to David and said, "Go up and build an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite." And as it says in verse 18, this divine command would pave the way for the atonement of sin and the end of the plague. David's census illustrates how even a man after God's own heart could fall into the sin of pride and self-reliance. His desire to know the exact number of his troops suggests that David was putting his trust in human strength rather than in divine power. God's response, through the plague, was severe, but it had a disciplinary purpose. He wanted to show David and Israel that the nation's security did not lie in the size of its army, but in the Lord's faithfulness and protection. David's intercession for the people, asking that the punishment fall on him and his family, reveals his shepherd king heart Like the good shepherd he had been in his youth, he was willing to sacrifice himself for the sheep of his flock. Following God's command, David went up as the Lord had commanded through Gad, as we read in 2 Samuel 24:19. When Araunah looked and saw the king and his officials approaching, he went out and bowed down before the king with his face to the ground, as it says in verse 20. Araunah asked, "Why has my lord the king come to his servant?" David replied, "To buy your threshing floor so I can build an altar to the Lord, that the plague on the people may be stopped," as recorded in verse 21. Generously, Araunah offered to give it all. "Let my lord the king take whatever he wishes and offer it up. Here are oxen for the burnt offering, and here are the threshing sledges and ox yokes for the wood," as we read in verse 22. He added, "Your Majesty, Araunah gives all this to the king." Then he said, "May the Lord your God accept you," showing respect for the God of Israel even as a Jebusite. But David insisted on paying. "No, I insist on paying you for it. I will not sacrifice to the Lord my God burnt offerings that cost me nothing," as stated in verse 24. This principle, that true worship involves sacrifice and personal cost, is one of the key lessons from this story. So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen for 50 shekels of silver, as we read in verse 24. David built an altar to the Lord there and sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. Then the Lord answered his prayer on behalf of the land, and the plague on Israel was stopped, as verse 25 concludes. What seems like a simple event carries profound historical significance. The threshing floor of Araunah was located on Mount Moriah, the same place where, centuries earlier, Abraham had taken Isaac to be sacrificed and where God provided a substitute. Now this same location became a meeting point between God and his people through sacrifice, ending the plague that threatened Israel. Even more significant, this very threshing floor would become the site where Solomon, David's son, would build the temple in Jerusalem. As we read in 2 Chronicles 3:1, "Then Solomon began to build the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to his father David. It was on the threshing floor of Araunah, Ornan, the Jebusite, the place provided by David." Thus David's final major official act was acquiring the very location that would become the heart of Israelite worship for generations. The place where the plague was halted would be transformed into the site where daily sacrifices would be made to atone for the sins of the people. David's insistence on paying for the threshing floor, even when it was offered for free, reveals much about his understanding of genuine worship. He knew that a sacrifice that costs nothing isn't truly a sacrifice. Authentic worship involves more than external rituals. It requires personal surrender and real cost. It's fitting that the book of 2 Samuel ends with this act of worship and sacrifice. Throughout his life, David experienced both great triumphs and devastating failures, but his story closes with him in the right posture before God, humble, repentant, and worshipful. The altar at Araunah's threshing floor marked the end of the plague that threatened Israel, but it also pointed toward the future. The place David purchased would become the center of Israel's worship, and in a broader sense, it foreshadowed a greater sacrifice that would one day remove the barrier between God and humanity once and for all. David's acquisition of Araunah's threshing floor provides a fitting conclusion to the story of 2 Samuel. The shepherd, warrior, fugitive, king, sinner, and worshipper ended his journey by preparing the way for his son and for the future of Israel. His final official act was establishing the location where future generations would worship the same God who had been his rock, fortress, and deliverer throughout his life. If you were encouraged by this journey through 2 Samuel, don't keep the blessing to yourself. Share this video with your friends, family, and faith community. Every share helps more people discover these powerful biblical stories presented in a way that truly touches the heart. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, what are you waiting for? Click that subscribe button now so you don't miss our upcoming videos on the books of the Bible. We have many more life-changing stories to explore together. Also, hit the notification bell to be alerted when we release new content. Drop a comment below and tell us which part of David's story impacted you the most. Thank you so much for joining us for the book of 2 Samuel like you've never seen before. May the lessons from David's life continue to inspire your walk with God. See you in the next video.